Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is our 25th episode and our first episode of 2024. So Happy New Year and cheers. Today we're talking about New Zealand's Bird of the Century, which was made famous recently by John Oliver on his show Last Week Tonight. The Puteketeke, which is a subspecies of the Great Crested Grebe, is a fascinating bird and a great way to start out the new year. From their elaborate mating dance where they present seaweed to their mate, to carrying their young on their back, there's so many weird and cool things that these birds do. John Oliver's campaign for this bird was so amazing, because although it was hilarious on the surface, it actually raised a ton of awareness for these birds, and at the same time raised awareness for birds in general, which hopefully will allocate more resources to their conservation. Okay, let's get into it. Grab your binoculars and let's get started. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope everyone had a good holiday season. This is our 25th episode that we've done and our first of 2024. And I think we wanted to kind of start out. People have been asking us, what started this, why we're getting together to do this podcast. So wanted to, before we jump into talking about our bird this week, kind of talk about why we're doing this. So does anyone want to jump in and start us out?
Well, that would probably be me, because podcasts have been so important in my life over the last 4 years. So traveling to and from the museum, I almost always have a podcast on. And I realized during the pandemic, when I was spending less time with people, that when I listened to my podcast, I felt like I got to know those people really well. And it was a very different kind of relationship than you might have to someone you see on TV. So it was much more personal, and I liked that idea. And the people I listened to on podcasts said that they too felt that in their podcasts, that the people who were listening to them felt more comfortable coming up to them, thought of them as friends. So it was, I liked that more personal experience, and I was hoping we could give people a more personal experience in that way.
Totally. I agree completely. And I guess from my perspective, I'm a huge nature fan, kind of have been my whole life. And John, Shannon, I'm totally jealous that you both get to work with birds every day. And I'm not as fortunate. And I kind of notice that when I'm not exposed to it, you kind of lose touch a little bit. And I think, watching shows like Planet Earth and the Discovery Channel always kind of would re-pique my interest. And I would see either an animal or a bird or something in nature that either I was familiar with and learn something new, or see like something completely different that I'd never heard of. And it just kind of makes you see the world differently and makes you appreciate things around you differently. And, we just kind of wanted to get together with you guys and create something that we could share that experience with other people and make it accessible. And in particular, I think birds are just amazing. Having really learned more about them in the past year and a half, they really are just like so incredible and so diverse, and there's so many impressive things about them. It's like peeling back layers of the onion. The more that you learn, you're like, oh my gosh, there's this and there's that. It kind of leads you down this incredible path. So just wanted to, with you guys, share that.
We would have never done this without you and Amanda. There's not a hope in any world that we would have done that, no matter how important podcasts were to me, no matter how much they taught me about things that I didn't know anything about, which I think is a fundamental aspect of being human, to learn things. But we would never have done this without you. I don't think I'm that interesting.
I disagree.
I'm not sure why people
disagree
listen.
too, Shannon. Yeah. And Shannon, we're so grateful to you and John for doing this with us. It's such a honor for us and so exciting to talk to you too. And I wanted to piggyback on what RJ was saying about just this thing has opened his eyes more to like the magic of birds. And for me, I totally agree with that. And also just we've had so much fun meeting bird people, and this has really motivated us to get out and participate more in experiences with other birders, and that's been amazing. I feel like that's really enriched our lives. And yeah, so that's my contribution.
Well, and I just say that, as Shannon was saying, we can be accused of getting, locked up in our offices and doing research and thinking only about the birds. And the big thing is it's about more than that. And getting to people like you guys out appreciating ornithology and birds on a broader sense it's just a fun opportunity for us.
After 4 years of basically meeting nobody unless they were in little tiny rectangles on my computer screen, that we're doing this in person and that we got to know you as like three-dimensional human beings is pretty nice too. And I have a lot of stress, and my doctor prescribed something to me. She actually wrote it down. She told me to walk 10 minutes away from my house outside every day and walk 10 minutes back. She said she didn't care where I went or what I did, that you need to go outside, that being outside is a prescription for health, as important as many drugs that people take. So, and I think she's right. So this is kind of, I hope it gets people to know that no matter what your level of expertise is, you can go outside and you can listen to birds and watch birds. You can be in nature and have the benefits that gives you.
It's so true.
Well,
It's like no matter what's going on in the world or what, how crazy the day is, if you take a little bit of time to notice what's around you or learn something new or talk with the three of you, it's always just kind of a little escape and kind of makes the day a little better.
and as we were talking about over the break while you guys were out in Colorado, I mean, there are different birds everywhere you go. And so, getting into what we're talking about today, we're talking about a bird from a completely other part of the world. And that's one of the things that I love is that birds are everywhere and they're doing all kinds of different things in all these different parts of the world.
Yeah, we had such an awesome experience just getting back from Colorado, like having not even really thinking about what we were going to see. And we were driving and all of a sudden saw grouse, and we're just like, oh, wow, we didn't see, we're not used to seeing this. It's like everywhere you go, it's a little bit different. You start seeing things differently. So I agree, John. Well, with that, should we get into our first bird of the year?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
We're going to talk about Puteketeke today, which came in a very weird, I didn't know very much about this bird until we watched John Oliver's HBO show, and he highlighted something that I've been participating in for a few years because of a very good friend of ours and colleague of ours lives in New Zealand. And so she has petitioned us to participate in this New Zealand Bird of the Year competition where you can vote no matter where you are in the world. You can vote for your favorite bird, New Zealand bird, and it goes to a really good cause. This conservation organization is working to preserve birds in New Zealand. I thought it was a really great thing for New Zealand to do. It seemed really interesting to me that they would focus so much energy on birds, and that I think that says a lot about that country and about them as people. So, of course, we participated in this, and so I've been voting for the last several years for my bird of the world, or whatever they call it.
Bird of the year.
Bird of the year. Yeah.
Yep.
Now we're in bird of the now we're in bird of the century. But
Century.
but
Shannon, last time we got together, you told us that you voted for something other than the Puteketeke or the Great Crested Grebe. So I was curious what you voted for this year.
I voted for the kiwi.
Oh, okay.
That was there. But, I have to admit that I'm both not surprised that this bird ended up winning, given the attention it got. And then the more I learned about it, I thought, well, okay, well, this is deserving, even if it might not have been my vote. It's definitely a deserving bird.
There are so many unique things about it that John Oliver listed, and then we went down a YouTube rabbit hole after that, watching all the different things. They're so cool looking. Just their
grebes are amazing, and the family itself. They're these fish-eating diving birds with these legs on the back of all the way in the back of their bodies, and these palmate feet, which allow them to basically propel themselves after fish and stuff. And so it's a group that's been around for a long time, and they have an incredibly large distribution. So one of the things I found hilarious about the whole thing is that Puteketeke is the New Zealand population of this more broadly distributed species.
Yeah, we were so confused because he talked all about the Puteketeke, and then when the Great Crested Grebe, I believe, is the actual name of it, and the Puteketeke might be the Maori name. But so they're actually native to a lot more places than New Zealand. I saw they're in Europe and Asia. And so do they migrate to New Zealand, or are they different populations, or?
So this is a neat thing about birds like this. This is a resident population that probably got there, not probably, they got there through dispersal at some point, probably originated in somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. They're all over Southeast Asia, but they all get all the way to Europe, and they're also in South Africa. And so it's absolutely fascinating because in general, grebes are an interesting group where they're actually one of the few aquatic groups. There are others, but there are few aquatic groups that actually have flightless species too. So
Oh, wow.
It's interesting to me that this population in New Zealand got there. They've maintained their flight capacity because they actually show up on some of the outlying islands sometimes off the coast of New Zealand. And again, it's one of the great examples of why birds are such amazing creatures in terms of what they have the capacity to do in terms of expanding their distributions over time.
We were looking at videos of them online swimming underwater, and we didn't realize how far back their legs are on their bodies. And when you watch them swim underwater, we were saying, they almost look like penguins the way that they're built. It was without kind of having wings and these legs that are located just kind of in the bottom of their bodies. It was a totally different point of view seeing them underwater versus them swimming above water, which we thought was a totally interesting look.
Did you watch videos of them walking on land? Because that they look hilarious doing.
No, I don't think I saw any of them walking.
Yeah, they don't look, you can tell that land is not their primary place of being. Because
do they walk upright like a penguin, or how do they walk?
No, they just
so
look like they're going to fall over because their center of gravity isn't in the middle. It's towards the back because of the propeller nature of their feet and in the water, and so to me they just look like they're just, someone needs to move their legs to the middle.
Yeah.
So there's another family of birds that eat fish and are adapted similarly in terms of having their legs way back in their bodies, and that's the loons. And so for one of the interesting things is based largely on that characteristic alone, the grebes and loons were grouped together for a long time. And then that all changed when molecular work came along.
Yeah, so now we know that that grebes, the family of grebes, their most closest living relative are flamingos, of which they look nothing like at all. So each group is completely novel. When you look at them, if you looked inside, you might put them together if you had a clue of what you were doing. But if you looked at the outside, you would never put these groups of birds together. So what it means is that your field guide that usually has grebes by loons, doesn't reflect the actual tree of life for birds. So the grebes need to go somewhere with flamingos. And that, to me, that's, I don't know, science is magic. To learn something like that, it can kind of reorient how you view other parts of their characteristics too. So then you start to think, well, if they have this and a grebe has this and a flamingo has this, do they do this thing the same way? Do they do it because they're evolutionarily related to each other? So clearly the convergence is in how loons and grebes look similar with their legs in the back. But that doesn't signify relationships. It just signifies birds that propel themselves in the water. And even at that, they do it completely differently. Loons do have webbed feet, but the lobed feet of a grebe are really interesting too. And you can see how well they can manipulate them there are videos of them underwater, and you can see that they have the ability to open and close, like change the streamlining of their lobed feet in the water. It's pretty neat.
And do the Great Crested Grebes or the Puteketeke, like, do they fly, or are they completely in the water?
So this is a neat thing about grebes. So a lot of times they spend long periods of time without flying. And as a matter of
Okay.
fact, in Great Crested Grebes or Puteketekes, there's evidence that their flight muscles actually atrophy for part of the year, and then they recover them in the breeding season. And I'd like to look more into that, because I wonder if that's something that's going to happen in migrant populations, but not in populations that aren't migrating. And so if you're not moving around, you don't need to necessarily fly anymore. And so this is a thing that's absolutely fascinating about Great Crested Grebes, Puteketekes, and the whole family, is the fact that they really have a number of species, and Great Crested Grebe is one of them, that have spread across a really large distribution across multiple continents, and yet at the same time spend most of their downtime when they're breeding or just feeding on the water, and in a situation where they won't fly. If you ask a
Wow.
lot of birders, most birders have not seen very many grebes flying.
Wow.
I don't know that I have really very much either. A little
And
bit
yet you've
maybe in
got
and out of
these.
the water.
Yep. And so they do it a lot of times at night. And so that may be one of the reasons. But if you go out like on Lake Michigan, for instance, you can occasionally see horned grebes and redneck grebes and pied-billed grebes, which are the common species around here, migrating along the lakefront.
And they're still really beautiful. They may not have some of the special features that the New Zealand grebes do, but they still are. They have beautiful feathers. Grebes do, and they have really beautiful feathers close too. So when you look at them in the hand, the specimens in the hand, you can first off, their feathers are extremely dense. It's on their back in particular. They must have a higher density of feathers than other birds, given just what they look like. I don't know if anybody's counted. That would be a tedious job to pluck in. How would you do that, John? How would you, besides just plucking every feather and counting from 1 to, I don't know, 20 or 40,000 or however many birds have?
That's been done, I think, on a few birds, and the
What?
numbers are pretty surprising. Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. So
Yeah.
how many Puteketeke do you have at the Field Museum?
We have none of that subspecies, but we do
Okay.
have 29 of the species in general. So most of
Okay.
ours are from Europe or Asia and Africa. But we have a bunch of eggs, which I found interesting. I'm just looking at my notes. We have eggs from Finland, England, and Germany in our collections. John, how did those things get to be in our collections?
So a lot of those are the result of this period in the early 1900s where collectors were exchanging eggs between Europe and North America. And so there was probably a collector, I can think of some names that are associated with the collection, who would have exchanged with some colleagues in Europe, where he sent North American eggs to them, and they sent European eggs to that person. And eventually those ended up in the collection. One of the things I was going to point out with respect to these populations is that nobody's done very much genetic work to look at the relationships of grebes at either the species or the population level. And so I'd be fascinated to know how different the Puteketeke is from these other populations of Great Crested Grebes around the world.
So do you think they could be like evolving, away from each other? The Puteketeke and Great Crested Grebes in Europe
Yep.
or other
And
parts of the world?
almost by definition, when you get a population that gets that isolated, it's going to start differentiating over time.
There certainly are some morphological characteristics across their range that make them look a little bit different. So, I mean, I think I agree with John that there's almost certainly going to be distinct genetic differences among these populations. I mean, most things that get on New Zealand are genetically distinct, and then they become incredibly morphologically distinct as well from other related taxa. So I expect they are.
Yeah, I know, Shannon, I know you were really excited to talk about New Zealand birds just because there are so many unique ones there. Is there a lot of that in New Zealand, just things that are isolated and have evolved?
Yeah, I didn't watch any of the Lord of the Rings movies, but all you have to do is see commercials of those movies to see just how spectacular the landscape is there, how much variation there is, and how magical it is, and how much change in elevation there is. All of those things promote diversification. So if you have an island that has that many different kinds of habitats, when things get there eventually, they're going to diversify, like what happened on in Hawaii when we were talking about the Hawaiian honey creepers. So there are a bunch of different birds. There are some incredibly bizarre things, like basically a terrestrial parrot. And that thing is the weirdest bird. It's called a kakapo. It's a very strange bird. There are really important conservation programs that are going on for that bird, genomics conservation programs that are really important, breeding programs and wild release. Every individual is tracked of that bird. So if you look that thing up online, it doesn't even seem like it could be real. It's so bizarre. And then you have flightless things like kiwis that are related to ostriches and rheas and tinamous in South America, for example. But so there's just a lot of really different things there.
Are there a lot of like flightless birds in that region in general? I feel like a few that we've talked about with the kiwi and the Puteketeke doesn't fly that much, it sounds like. And
I think one of the big challenges, on islands in general, and New Zealand is obviously multiple islands, some of which are actually pretty big, is if you've got the possibility of, once the birds get there, is they don't have a lot of predators. And so when you don't have a lot of predators, you don't have to fly. And if you don't have to fly and can find food and maintain your populations, you become flightless. And so it's a really interesting pattern that shows up again and again across birds, specifically associated with island habitats most of the time because of the lack of predation. And then the conservation challenge comes up because as humans get to these islands, you've got the native populations of the Maoris who got there, and then Europeans coming later. They've altered a lot of the habitats, and a lot of the birds don't do particularly well as habitat gets altered. But then you've also got the introduction of things like rats and commensal animals, mammals that are going around and also affecting the nesting success of some of these birds. And so that's why so many of these things become conservation concerns pretty quickly.
And is New Zealand pretty progressive and like pretty kind of leading the way as far as conservation, aren't they?
They have a long history of thinking about measures to eradicate some of the introduced pests, but also they've had this interesting program of realizing that in some areas for birds like kiwis, they may not be able to keep them on the big islands anymore because of the habitat destruction. And so they've actually moved populations and established them on off-lying areas which have the same habitat, but were too small to have been colonized by these birds historically. And they don't have the predators, and they can actually maintain the populations. And it's a procedure that's worked for a number of species.
I mean, if you think about it, that forest and bird conservation organization that promoted this Bird of the Year thing, that is 100 years. This is why it's Bird of the Century this year. So that conservation organization has been functional for 100 years, which is really I mean, I think that is a testament to a long-term emphasis that New Zealand has placed on conservation.
Is there any bird of the year competition in the US? Like, it's such a fun thing that New Zealand does that. I feel like there should be one here.
Well, my guess, given what John Oliver did for the Puteketeke, sort of going global with it, I'm guessing that there are a number of organizations in the U.S. that are actually looking down the lists and wondering what they could do.
I mean, if anybody hasn't, if you should go and find, there's YouTube has plenty of links to John Oliver's discussion of the Puteketeke, and it's absolutely hilarious. His fascination with this bird is like jaw-droppingly funny. But as he usually does, when he gets his kind of teeth into something like that, he takes it to, he goes in places not normal people would never go. So he and his staff are intensely creative. So they put up, they decided they wanted it to win the Bird of the Year, Bird of the Century contest. And so he put billboards up all over the world, in London, in Mumbai. He actually had a plane pull a banner in Brazil promoting this bird. So they had, I looked this up, they had over 350,000 people voted from 195 countries.
Oh
my
which
gosh.
is basically the next highest number of votes was 56,000, almost 57,000. So, I mean, that's a lot more attention on New Zealand birds. That could make people decide they could contribute to, to this organization, which does great things, but maybe that they could go to New Zealand, or that it takes them places, other places. So, Lord of the Rings isn't just a movie. It actually comes from a real place where these real birds actually live.
And I think too, like, by, raising awareness about the Puteketeke, like, me personally, I started looking at like the other birds that were on the list. Just like, I'm kind of Googling like what else is out there. And it's like, I feel like just raising awareness on one thing kind of shines a light on everything. So hopefully that does
and
that
their
for more people
website,
too.
I love that they have a lot of possibilities in your voting, because you just get sucked down into thinking, oh, what's that one? What's this one? What's this one? So voting is actually really hard because you end up liking them. There's value to all of them, except a couple of years ago, a long-tailed bat won the competition.
Ah,
That I don't think I approved of. I did not
I'm
vote
sure
for the
you didn't.
bat.
I was going to, yeah, you wouldn't have voted for it, but I like that. I mean, I'm guessing you guys would think about going to New Zealand.
yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely.
for sure. You're right.
Yeah. There's so many cool things we want to see down there now after reading
Yeah.
about this. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And then a few of the things like we haven't touched on yet, but just that were so unique about the Puteketeke also is like their mating dance that they do, which
Yeah.
John Oliver talked about a lot. So if you've seen that, but
Yeah, he
we
has
were
a
watching
costume.
videos of it.
I decided that you guys should wear that costume. You should ask him if he can borrow it.
Yes.
But I mean, they are hilarious birds. I actually learned a new word, and I don't know why I didn't know this word, but I learned what a tippet was. I did not know
Oh.
that those kind of weird feathers that are coming out of their necks, the long feathers, are called tippets, which I didn't
Okay.
know. So I love new words. I get new words from Word Guru to my inbox, my email inbox several times a day. I love new words. So that was a new word for me. And watching their mating videos is absolutely and utterly hilarious, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they take vegetation and then they kind of half fly, half run across the water at each other with his vegetation in their mouth, and then they kind of mimic each other in how they turn their heads and behave. I mean, it's really and their feathers are so pretty too, with that kind of chestnut brown color and the deep richness of the black. They're really, and they have these during the breeding season, at least. I don't know what happens to them in the non-breeding season. They have, their eyes are vivid red, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, it almost looks like a lion's mane or something, the way that its feathers all stick out. And I mean, it's just kind of crazy. When you see it up close too, the videos, you're like, wow, this is incredible. And then we also watch the videos of when they carry their young on their backs too.
I know. Is
And
that
so,
sweet?
yeah.
So cute.
And so I saw that their young can swim basically like right after they hatch. So they swim in the water and then they'll hop on the mom's back or the dad's back, I think, as well. And kind of go along for a ride.
Yeah, and the aquatic nature of them is just incredible. So the nests are actually generally on floating vegetation. It's pretty rare that they actually build them on land. And so, these young birds which again are going to be capable of flight in the case of the Puteketeke, basically are spending their whole lives on water as they grow up and get ready to fledge.
And I mean,
That's really different than ducks, for instance, which come on land at night and roost and things.
so the populations declined pretty dramatically until there were maybe 200 birds left only. Now there's somewhat under 1,000 of them, apparently. And there's this retired zoologist. His name is John Darby. And our friend Rosemary had talked to me about him, but he creates habitat for them so that like platforms for them to nest on in the water. And he gets help now from university students to maintain habitat for these. And that's probably one of the reasons why the population has increased. And they interviewed him as John Oliver did this promotion for Puteketeke, and he was ecstatic about that species having a lot more attention being put on it. So hopefully that gets him more resources too.
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting close on time. Is there anything else we wanted to talk about for the Puteketeke or the Great Crested Grebe?
They eat their feathers. There's no end of weird things you could talk about.
Yeah.
And that's many times the baby's first meal is feathers that they plucked out, that the parent birds have plucked out of themselves and given to their babies. And so there was a really interesting paper. There's been a lot of speculation because they throw it up too. So that's another reason why John Oliver was so fascinated by this bird, is because they throw up hunks and piles of feathers. But the feathers are mixed with the hard shells of whatever invertebrates they might be eating or whatever vertebrates they might have. And so it turns out that what the hypothesis now is that they keep those feathers in their stomachs, and the feathers kind of hold on to the hard things so that the bird can extract all the nutrients out rather than having it all go so quickly through the digestive system, and then they just hawk it all up. So and I guess they do this many times a day. They just will throw up the feathers mixed with bones and shells and stuff like that. So they want to put
now you know why they have so many feathers.
Yeah. So they want to give the baby birds those feathers so that when they give them other things, because the birds are fairly precocial, right? So when they get other things, that they have enough time in the digestive system to get the nutrients out of the bones or out of the shells, so and suck all the other juices out of that before, you just spit out the hard things, which if you swallowed them, you could, rough things like that could cause scratching and tearing, I guess, of the digestive tract. So the idea that this spike-headed, punk-looking bird then just throws up its own feathers several times a day, that image is pretty amazing.
It's very punk rock.
Yes.
Metal. And that's another thing I am now a victim of retail therapy associated with this bird in particular, because there's this artist, and he has a website. It's called metalbird.com. And I just bought a Puteketeke of his. And he has also the Puteketeke friend, which is a little John Oliver that can hang off the Puteketeke. So you can go look at his website, and they're beautifully cut out pieces of metal that you can put in your yard and stick in a tree. They're really, really beautiful. So we have a Puteketeke coming to us hopefully soon.
All right. Well, I think that's everything for today then. Any last words before we call it for the day?
I'd just say that Puteketeke is a great example of the kind of bird that we could talk about over and over again, different species that get people thinking about where else in the world they should think about visiting.
And go vote next year.
Yeah.
Learn more about New Zealand birds and vote.
And somebody started a U.S. Bird of the Year too.
I thought of that too. But then when I went to the metalbird.com thing, you can pick where in the world you are and look at the birds he's made from these places. And then I decided that
how cool.
The birds from New Zealand were cooler than the North American birds. So we'll have some New Zealand sculptures in our backyard.
Thanks everyone for listening. Shannon proposed that we get a hold of John Oliver's bird costume, so if anyone has any connections, please hook us up. I'm sure the costume is just sitting on a shelf now, so we'd love to wear it for our next episode. Please tag Last Week Tonight and John Oliver on our socials so we can all connect and talk about the Puteketeke. All right, cheers everyone.